book friends that think good.
What does this mean for our life, for our world? Yiggity yeet, my dude. I'm happy to speak. Always happy to think.
I don't know how to do that. I can look into that.
Makes you sound like a book friend that can think good.
It's Jack and it's Weston.
BFTTGs. Yeah.
Jack, I think good. Sometimes I good think, too.
Makes you sound pretty good.
We might want to make it more concise. We are going to attempt to grapple and answer 3 questions. Number 1, what did we learn? Number 2, what did we disagree with? And number 3, what are we going to do about it? I am ready to roll.
I'm in it. Weston, my book friend, tell me, what book is it that we're thinking good about today?
Cannot wait to talk about statistics being used in person, bro. Like, I'm living it. I'm living it right now. We are discussing Chapter 3 of A Field Guide to Lies and Statistics, Axes Shenanigans. So,
Shenanigans.
Yeah, how can you mess around with these axes and pull some magic tricks out of your butt? No.
Exactly. That is what we're thinking good about today. So, here's a summary sort of statement for this chapter. It comes from the second paragraph of the chapter, and it says, there are many ways that graphs can be used to manipulate, distort, and misrepresent data. The careful consumer of information will avoid being drawn in by them. And what I thought I would do, Weston, with this particular book, because it's a field guide, sort of I thought I would just state the subtopics of this chapter, we can kind of walk through those. But here are the subtopics for Axis Shenanigans, and all of this relates to graphically representing data. One is unlabeled axes. The second is the truncated vertical axis, which I think is hilarious. The examples he uses there are great. Discontinuity and vertical or horizontal axes. And then choosing the proper scale and axis. And then the last subsection is the dreaded double Y axis, which was one of my favorite sections, and definitely a learning for me right off the bat was the double Y axis. I personally have never seen these graphs, or I don't remember seeing them. And I was kind of wondering, how does a double Y axis graph actually even work? Because I don't know. I'd have to plug some numbers into Excel and see how that actually works out, but pretty funny to see how things are reported. And then, as I went through some examples, it makes sense why you would use graphs like this. But the thing he says right at the beginning of that section on double y-axes is the graph maker can get away with all kinds of lies simply armed with the knowledge that most readers will not look at graphs very closely, which I thought was a really good lead into this chapter and really good statement about how graphs are used. So Weston, what were some learnings for you as we started looking at Axis Shenanigans this week?
Well, I just thought, like he says, basically I feel like this chapter, all of those subcategories can be lumped into just look at the graphs carefully so you can see where they're trying to trick you or where they might be accidentally misleading you, right? And me, in my educator lens, I took that and I was just like, it's not a learning, but again, a good reminder, labels is the most common feedback I give to my students when we're doing graphical analyses like these. Literally, and even just on any word problems, really. It's literally probably the most common word I write on students' papers throughout the year. Labels. Because one, they need to clearly articulate, what it is they solved, what's on their graph and everything. But also the act of having the students write the labels down, on at least several steps, keeps it straight in their brain, because they make the most mistakes when some number or something isn't labeled and they're not checking, referring back to whatever they were working on to make sure that number relates to that label. So they make mistakes just mixing those up, honest mistakes. So I'm always just like label, 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 so you can keep everything straight.
Yeah. The example he throws in there of unlabeled axes are gross sales from a book publisher, excluding Kickstarter sales. And it's just this, up and down graph. I guess it has a generally positive trend line, but the quote that is reported to say it just has year on the x-axis, and the y-axis is totally unlabeled.
Yeah.
And it says another great year of sales. And he says, I guess we'll just have to take their word for it. And I think that's a really reasonable conclusion for graphs like these.
And that is actually my second note here. I said a website, article, book, whatever loses all credibility with me when I can't understand the graph presented to me. Like if I don't understand it, I make the negative assumption that you are trying to trick me, and I just completely discredit that graph and usually that entire organization. So perhaps I'm a little harsh on that, but I am very like guarded about that, where it's like, dude, because every graph I see, I usually try to interpret it. And if they can't even make a graph right, how am I supposed to trust anything that you're saying?
Yeah, I make two assumptions, two snap judgments when I see graphs. One is like if I can't interpret the data in a graph, these are the two snap judgments I make. One is either this person is out of touch with me, the reader. If it's too complex or like presented in a weird way that's not well explained, I'm like, I don't even know what data I'm looking at. So like it makes me distrustful of the author, because I think like, well, they have no connection to me. Like they don't understand me. Why are they writing this to me? How am I supposed to get this? So that's one assumption that I make, is like, oh, they're out of touch with their readership. The other assumption that I make is that they're trying to lie to me. Like this complexity is hiding something and I don't like it.
That's funny, dude. Because I make that assumption, right? That they're trying to lie to me. But I think my second next assumption is that they're stupid.
Right.
It's like they're either trying to lie to me or they're incompetent. So either way, I don't want to deal with them.
Yeah, which is another bad thing, right? Where you just think like, what is this? What is this data? What is this graph? Or like there are a couple examples of that where if I saw some of these visually represented, like he gives the example of the Bush tax cuts with truncated vertical axes, where like it shows a massive like two bars and there's a massive difference between them, but it's because it's zoomed really close, really far into tax rate, and the difference is between 35% and 40%, which is 5% difference. So when you zoom out, you put that like on a 0 to 50 scale, it is a tenth of the graph. But if you zoom all the way in, it looks like an 80% difference, when you're looking at it on in 2% increments.
Exactly. So the truncated part is just basically they're starting one of the axes, usually the vertical axes, not from zero. They just cut out the bottom part of it to make it focus on the difference of whatever the data is showing, and like exacerbating that. And I've definitely seen that one a lot. Oh yeah.
This is something that I came across a ton when I was reading scientific literature in college. This was something that PhD students and, researchers do all the time. And part of the reason they do it is to cut out noise, because and you have to do some reading and interpreting to really interpret like, well, why is this a big deal? Like a good example is something like, like pH, right? Like there is only so much variation in pH. And when you're looking at something that's like, like body systems or whatever, pH exists in sort of like a normal range where you physically cannot have outliers in a certain range. So like to chart it from 1 to 14, which is the actual pH range,
right,
that's useful for chemistry, but for biology, that's not as useful, because biological systems, if they're in the like 2 and lower range, or they're in the like 11 and higher range, like that organism is dead, right? Like that's just like, that's not common in like in mammalian biology specifically. So like there are examples like that where it actually makes sense. Yeah.
Well, it just made me think of like, I just had my yearly physical done and they showed me like my blood acid level or whatever. And I think the range on that graph was only, I want to say it was like only 5 to 9.
Yeah, probably.
So, which would
Because
make
like,
sense.
yeah, because if it's, below 5, it's like you're dead.
Yeah.
Like that's not
Yeah. You've turned into
you're
an
beyond
acid
help.
monster, my friend.
Yeah. Yeah. Then the question is, what is Weston?
What is that? Yeah.
Not who are you, but what are you?
So then next up was the discontinuous axes, which
I thought this was hilarious.
Yeah.
This is the kind of example where if I saw this, I'd just be like, there's some monkey business going on here.
Okay, that was my thought either. That was my thought exactly. My note on it was, I don't think I've ever seen a discontinuous axis like this. I don't think I've ever seen it because it seems so obviously bullshit.
Yeah, right. Totally. Totally. This is where you'd have like a break in the data so that like the line stops and then you see a different measure. Like it truncates the x-axis in one example, or it drastically changes the spacing between the parts of the lines that are graphed.
Yeah.
And like these are the kind of things that look like funny business. Like
for sure.
There's just no way that I would encounter this and not the flags wouldn't go off in my head where it's like, okay, what is this about?
Yeah, I totally agree on that one. Just on the truncated one was like, I know I've seen it a lot, but I wonder like how many times where I've come across something that I've been fooled. Like this chapter definitely made me think about like, how many times in my life have I been taken for a fool and it worked? It like made me like anxious about that, dude. I was like, dude, what do I believe now that I shouldn't? That like, what's a garbage stat I know that's just awful?
I feel like we're seeing this all the time right now with what's going on with inflation in America. Like it's all comparative, right? So it's like, prices have risen X percentage and like the percentages look totally whack, but it's like, well, what's the baseline for comparison? And I mean, I don't know. It is bad. Like inflation is definitely like it's tangible, at least for me. I feel like
totally.
I'm noticing it.
Yeah.
Like, but still, I think every time I see like percentages and graphs and stuff, I think, what's really being graphed here? And oftentimes another like telltale sign for me that something is going on is if like data is presented quickly, where it's like, check out this graph. Oh, don't look at the graph too long.
Right, exactly, dude. Yeah, that's a great point. If it's especially on like TV shows or whatever, right? It's like if it's presented and you're not allowed to look at it for like more than a couple seconds, that's very much like, wait a second, bring that back. I want to look at that again.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about pushback. Did you have any pushback, any areas of disagreement in this chapter, or areas of like questioning?
I guess my disagreement was right there on page 31 that we talked about. I just wrote, I've never seen a discontinuous x-axis like that. That's suspicious AF. Like that's what I wrote. I was like, I've never seen that, and if I did see it, I would not trust it for a second.
Yeah. I think
but I think a lot of the other ones though, like I've seen real life examples of them and they're much easier to slip by. I think that's probably why the discontinuous x-axis is not used a lot, because it's so much more obvious.
Yeah.
Literally in like the line of the graph. Whereas like the other ones, like the graph looks normal and the axes or the numbers or the labels are what you have to look at carefully. And so the discontinuous x-axis is like, well, even if I just look at the graph line, like it looks messed up. So
yeah, I think this wasn't pushback for me. Really, he opens the whole chapter by making the case that like the human brain didn't evolve to process large amounts of numerical data. Instead, our eyes look for patterns in data that are visually displayed. And I think that that's true. I think I wouldn't push back at that at all. I think it just like furthers the point throughout this chapter that like how things are visually displayed is not always data. Like that's so much interpretation, and I think he does a good job of addressing that. But like,
Yeah, I think so too.
that is something that I just want to be careful to like explicitly recognize is like when I see a visualization of data, it is not data. It is automatically an interpretation. Like the fact that it is visualized in whatever form, just the fact that you chose a certain graph. Like a really good example is, and I think that's where the double y-axis is so dubious, is like because the double y-axis is measuring two things on different scales in the same visualization.
Yeah.
That is really quite confusing for most people. And I think anytime you have multiple sets of data, like I have the same qualm or like gripe about dual line graphs. Like when you have, if you're looking at like multiple things in the same data set, it's like, well, should we be comparing these things?
Yeah.
Or is comparing these things just, convenient for the point that we're trying to make?
Yes. No, I totally agree with that, dude. It's the double y-axis is like, I think the next biggest red flag besides that discontinuous x-axis. Anytime I see, because that one I've actually seen, right? Like I've seen the double y-axis, and that just instantly makes me go, wait a second, what are these axes? Wait a second. Wait a second. It's like, so that's not a good way to trick me, because my brain instantly goes to like, well, now I need to see what's on either side.
Yeah. I think one of the things, and this kind of gets into maybe my pushback, is like, I wish he would have mentioned this specifically in the chapter, that like some of these techniques are stacked on top of each other. He uses an example of that, but doesn't specifically call it out when he's talking about school funding versus SAT scores. That's both truncated Y and double Y. Yeah. So it commits two fallacies in the same set of data. And so it's like doubly confusing. Where you go, oh, interesting. Like this is looking at a truncated set of data to present to me exactly what they want. I think that's something to bear in mind as we're reading this, is like, just because he presents a concept doesn't mean that the other concepts don't also apply, which is something that I think critical thinking requires, is the ability to hold two thoughts simultaneously, right? Like, this data is like both on the positive and the negative. Like, oh, this data is lying to me in this way, and it's also lying to me in this way. But on the positive side, and he does specifically call this out, which I really appreciate, which is like, we need to ask the question of like what underlying factors might cause, what about the way the data is collected or presented could be hiding an underlying truth. Which is like what we talked about with the pH thing. Like there is a truncated axis, but is that warranted? Like maybe that's warranted for some reason.
So one of my slight pushbacks to this was in this chapter, while I understood that I have seen a lot of these kinds of graphs in the past, like I just wish he had better real life examples. And it was funny that he didn't, because I am now in a real life example. So I mentioned on the podcast, I'm an educator. Currently, right now, my district and my union is like, we're striking. We're striking for some contract negotiation issues. And the district just put out, and I'll put these on screen, they just put out a graph that has a bar graph of the last 4 years of how many staff they've employed, and then a bar graph or a line graph overlaid on it of how many students the district has. It's a double Y graph, but it's a pretty confusing double Y graph. And basically all they're trying to show is that enrollment has dropped while they've hired more staff, but it doesn't take into account the kind of staff they've hired and any of the reasons why those students would have disenrolled or enrolled in an alternative education instead, because it's all through COVID. The last 4 years are all through COVID. So districts everywhere saw enrollment decline. And then, so anyways, the big thing they were trying to push out to our communities too was class size. And this is another one where they just put out a simple graphic. I'll show it on screen. It's just supposed to be simple, easy to read, and support their point, right? And so they put out this graphic that says our average class size in K3 is 18 students. In 4th through 6th, it's 21. 7th and 8th grade, it's 23. And high school, it's 25 students per class. Those are our averages across the district. The teachers shouldn't want smaller class sizes, is what they're implying, right?
Yeah.
But what they did, dude, what they did in this data was included everyone in our district as a class teacher and then divided that with the total students. So as a specific example, because I did the math today when we were striking it on the picket line, I was like on my phone doing the math. My school has 22 classroom teachers, and we have about 400 students. And that sounds like a pretty good ratio, right? But they also included the PE, the music teacher, our school nurse. They included our behavior interventionists. They included our OT, our speech therapist. So we added
all of these people teachers, classroom teachers.
Yes. So right. They shared,
which is fallacious.
Exactly. It included with those. There's nine of those people, right? So it made our classroom teachers go from 22 to 31. So all of a sudden, that looks like our numbers were like way lower than they actually are. It averaged about. It decreased our average class size by about 6 with my math today.
Interesting.
Right? That's a big difference. And then the other thing that they did is the data that they included in that graph was only from 2020, 2021, which we know. Yeah. And as a country, as a society, we know that is the year that enrollment was at its lowest for most schools because parents didn't want to send their kids in because they were worried about COVID, or they were worried about the safety measures, or they were trying out homeschool because virtual teaching through the public system wasn't working. There were all these other mitigating factors that led to our enrollment being at an all-time low in that year. So not only was it like they used the lowest amount of students they could, and then they used the most amount of union staff they could to fudge the numbers. And when in reality, my class, I've never had a class of 21. And they're saying the average class in my grade is 21. And I've never had a class lower than 27. Like,
interesting.
Yeah. So I'm seeing it in action, dude. Like, it's wild. Now, luckily enough for me, so far, the support I've felt from the community and like neighbors and stuff I've been texting and talking to, and people that drive up to the picket line and stuff, we talk to them. Seems like we have the whole community behind us at this point. They see through it, but man, the district is trying. They are trying some of these statistical manipulations.
And that actually segues pretty well into my learning, like what I learned from this chapter and what I want to take from it, which is earlier this week, I was thinking about it from this analogy. Earlier this week, there were fruit flies in our kitchen. And it prompted me to say, where's the fruit? There's got to be spoiled fruit. There's got to be something that causes fruit flies. And I think that is the learning for me, is like, you see something fishy, you ask, where's the fish? Right? Yep. Where is that? What's the... And I think the question for us when we look at data is always to ask, like, well, what's the motive of the person presenting this data? Yeah. Right? Like, if you see, he talks about this, I'm really excited to get into the next chapter and talk about how numbers are reported. But if you see something fishy, you might ask yourself, okay, where's this graph from? What is the reason that someone might present data this way? And like, what would they try to be doing with it? Like in your case, you have this dispute. And the question is like, well, if you see data from one of the plaintiffs in that dispute, you have to imagine that they're making a case for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so you always need to think about that. And I think that to me is the learning. Is like, before I even look at the data and interpret graphs, one, to keep an eye out for those weird things they're looking on, but to ask the first question to ask for me is, okay, what is this trying to sell me?
Yep.
So that's something that I just want to kind of carry with me as I'm looking at visual data.
I think that's a great one. I didn't write down anything about the motive, so that's good for me to think about too. My big takeaway was just always read the axes, labels, and numbers. And like I said earlier, I've always been skeptical of graphs that don't have labels or numbers. Or honestly, I'm skeptical of ones that don't have data points too.
Yeah. Like named data points.
Yeah, exactly. So this just gave me more reason to do that, to carefully look at axes, numbers, labels. So keep a sharp eye out there.
Yeah. Keep an eye out, book friends. Keep thinking good.
Thank you for joining us, book friends. Next week on the BFTTG pod, Jack and Weston, they're thinking good some more with you, our book friends. Check out the show notes or the description, comment section for a link to the book and any articles that we talk about in the show. Bye-bye, book friends.
Bye for this time, guys.
Do a good thing today.
I love you.
Love you too, dude.